Picture this. It's 1993, and Mel Brooks, the same man who made Nazis sing show tunes and turned Frankenstein's monster into a soft shoe act, decides his next target is Robin Hood. Not the whole legend. Specifically the very serious, very expensive Kevin Costner version that had come out 2 years earlier. The result was a movie with a fake sheriff named Rottingham, a witch named Latrine, and a hero who spent the entire runtime proving he can do an English accent better than the guy who actually played the part before him. Robin Hood. Men in Tights hit theaters on July 28, 1993, distributed by 20th Century Fox, directed and produced by Mel Brooks himself. It starred Cary Elwes as Robin Hood, Richard Lewis as a whiny Prince John, Roger Rees as the scenery-devouring sheriff of Rottingham, Amy Yasbeck as Maid Marian, Isaac Hayes, and a young Dave Chappelle as father and son merry men, and Tracy Ullman as the deadpan witch Latrine. Today we're counting down 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally ridiculous facts about how this movie actually got made, including a phone call that almost cost an actor the lead role, a wrestling legend who could have been in Sherwood Forest, and a joke so specific it had to be rewritten for 4 different countries. Before we ride into the forest, if you're the type who likes learning why a dumb joke on screen was actually a very deliberate decision behind the scenes, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of digging where it came from. All right, let's get into it. Before he ever put on the green tights, Cary Elwes nearly torpedoed the whole thing with one phone call. According to accounts from the production, when Mel Brooks first rang Elwes's home to offer him the lead role, Elwes assumed it was a friend pranking him and hung up on the man. Brooks, not exactly used to being brushed off, called right back to convince him it was really him on the line. Elwes has since talked about how mortified he was once it sank in that he just hung up on one of his comedy heroes, the director behind Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, mid-job offer. It's a strange footnote precisely because of how well it worked out. Once he got over the shock, Elwes signed on, and his very British delivery became the engine of the entire movie's central joke. More on that later. Think about how easily this could have gone the other way. Brooks wasn't calling a stranger cold off a casting sheet. By 1993, he was already a legend in his own right, decades into a career that had produced some of the most quoted comedies in American film. If Elwes had simply not answered when Brooks tried again, or if Brooks had shrugged it off and moved down his list, the entire cast dynamic of the film might have looked completely different. Instead, a single moment of very understandable skepticism became one of the more charming pieces of the movie's origin story. Proof that even a director as established as Brooks still had to work a little to convince someone the offer was real. This is the one that sounds made up but genuinely isn't. Sean Connery had already played King Richard in a brief, now famous cameo at the end of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves in 1991. When Brooks started assembling Men in Tights, Connery reportedly floated the idea of reprising the role himself, this time as a parody, in full drag. Screenwriter J.D. Shapiro has described the moment it almost happened in person. Connery sat down for lunch with Brooks and Shapiro during pre-production, and the idea was pitched right there at the table. There was a catch, though. Connery wanted a fee in the neighborhood of $1 million, which by most accounts he intended to donate entirely to charity, a habit he'd already established after doing the original Prince of Thieves cameo essentially for a fraction of that and giving the money to a hospital in Scotland. A comedy about men in green leggings simply didn't have that kind of budget, and Brooks ultimately passed. There's a further wrinkle to the story, too. Some accounts suggest Brooks had more than just money on his mind. A comedic performer as commanding as Sean Connery, playing the bit in drag, ran the very real risk of walking off with the entire movie, becoming the single thing everybody talked about instead of the film as a whole. Whatever the exact mix of budget and ego was behind the decision, Brooks passed on the idea, and Patrick Stewart stepped into the role instead, playing King Richard completely straight, except for one very deliberate touch. Stewart performs the part with a thick Scottish accent, a direct wink at Connery's own performance in the original film. So even without Connery physically on set, his fingerprints are all over the joke. Before Eric Allen Kramer ever laced up as Little John, the part reportedly went out to a very different kind of big man, Hulk Hogan. The wrestling icon was offered the role of Little John from Men in Tights and turned it down. It's easy to see the appeal on paper. Hogan had the size, the presence, and by the early 90s, a track record of moving between the ring and the screen. But the role instead went to Kramer, a trained actor and fight choreographer who could match Brooks's rhythm of physical comedy and line delivery in equal measure. Kramer had already built a resume in offbeat physical roles. He played Thor in the 1988 TV movie The Incredible Hulk Returns years before pulling on Little John's tunic. So he wasn't exactly unfamiliar with playing outsized characters for a camera. It's a strange thought experiment. An alternate universe where the guy famous for wrestling in the ring for real was instead getting flattened by a quarterstaff for laughs in Sherwood Forest. Wrestlers crossing over into film comedy wasn't unheard of at the time, but the tone of a Mel Brooks parody is a very particular skill set. It requires an actor who can sell physical size as a punchline while also nailing the rhythm of a scripted joke, not just showing up as a larger-than-life presence. Kramer's background in stage work and fight choreography made him a better fit for that specific job than sheer size alone would have been, which may be part of why the role landed where it did. Here's a detail that makes Elvis's casting feel less like luck and more like inevitability. Elvis based his swashbuckling performance in The Princess Bride back in 1987 directly on Errol Flynn's portrayal of Robin Hood in the 1938 classic The Adventures of Robin Hood. In other words, years before he ever put on the tights, Elvis had already essentially studied and performed a version of Robin Hood. He just did it under a different character's name. When Brooks and his team went looking for someone who could sell both the swordplay and the theatrical bravado the role demanded, Elvis arrived already fluent in the exact cinematic language they wanted to spoof. It's the kind of coincidence that only looks obvious in hindsight. The actor cast to lovingly mock the legend of Robin Hood had unknowingly been rehearsing for the part since the mid-'80s. There's a nice bit of symmetry buried in that timeline, too. Flynn's 1938 version is widely considered the gold standard of swashbuckling Robin Hood performances, confident, athletic, permanently amused with itself. Elvis absorbing that style for The Princess Bride, then later getting to play an actual, credited Robin Hood, who winks directly at the audience, means Men in Tights effectively closes a loop that started years before Brooks ever picked up the phone to cast him. It's rare for a parody to land on an actor who's already spent real time studying the thing being parodied. But that's exactly what happened here. Not every joke in Men in Tights came from a page. Some of the funniest material was built live, on the day, by actors who knew how to read a room. The scene where the Sheriff of Rottingham, Roger Rees, crashes through the ceiling of Latrine's bedroom, and Latrine, Tracy Ullman, tries to seize the opportunity rather than panic, was completely improvised by Rees and Ullman on set. The bones of the physical gag were there, but the specific back and forth between the two characters, the tone, the shameless opportunism of Latrine's reaction, all of that came from the actors themselves in the moment. It's a good reminder that even in a tightly plotted parody with musical numbers and choreography, some of Brooks's best material happened because he was smart enough to just let two skilled comedic performers riff. Both Rees and Ullman came into the project with strong comedic instincts of their own. Rees from a background in stage and television, Ullman already an established sketch performer with a knack for playing characters who react to chaos with total emotional detachment. Handing two performers like that a physical setup and letting them find the actual joke themselves is a different creative approach than scripting every beat in advance, and it's part of why some of the smaller character moments in the film still land even decades later, long after some of the bigger scripted gags have faded from memory. For a movie built on silliness, some of that silliness took a surprising amount of engineering. There's a gag involving a row of guards falling down in sequence, one after another, like dominoes. According to accounts from the production, that single shot took several weeks of preparation to actually pull off correctly on camera. It's the kind of joke that reads as effortless and disposable on screen. A few seconds of guys toppling over, but getting the timing, spacing, and physical choreography to land cleanly in one continuous shot required real rehearsal. While we're on the subject of jokes born on set, there's also a smaller, stranger one buried in the credits. A minor assassin character was originally written and named as a direct riff on Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry. But on the day that scene was being shot, Italian director Ezio Greggio happened to be visiting the set, and Brooks decided on the spot to rename the character Dirty Ezio, as a joke tribute to his colleague, standing right there watching. It's a throwaway gag that only exists because of who happened to wander by that day. If you've ever watched Men in Tights and noticed that Prince John's facial mole seems to wander, cheek, chin, lip, other cheek, forehead, you weren't imagining things. That's a deliberate, ongoing sight gag. It's a direct parody of a continuity slip in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, where Alan Rickman's mole as the sheriff of Nottingham noticeably changed position between takes due to an unintentional makeup inconsistency. Rather than let that kind of mistake just be trivia for eagle-eyed viewers of the original, Brooks built it into an entire recurring gag for Richard Lewis's Prince John, moving the mole around his face scene to scene until even the character himself seems to notice something's off. It's also been noted as a spiritual cousin to Brooks's earlier shifting hump gag with Igor in Young Frankenstein, another running joke built entirely around something on a character's body that keeps mysteriously relocating. It's one of those gags that rewards you specifically for having seen the movie it's making fun of. Miss that context, and it's just a weird mole. Catch it, and it's Brooks quietly needling an entire big-budget blockbuster for a continuity error nobody else even mentioned. Brooks appears in the film as Rabbi Tuckman, a Jewish reimagining of the traditional Friar Tuck character. Given that Brooks is Jewish, having his character be a priest didn't quite fit, so the part was rewritten from the ground up into a moil, the ceremonial role involved in Jewish circumcision, instead of a friar. It's a small swap that turns a stock medieval archetype into a running bit specific to Brooks's own comedic voice. He wasn't the only person on this production returning to well-worn ground, either. This wasn't Brooks's first attempt at spoofing Robin Hood. Nearly 2 decades earlier, in 1975, he'd already tried a version of this idea with a short-lived ABC sitcom called When Things Were Rotten, which lasted only about half a season. Actor Dick Van Patten had played Friar Tuck in that earlier show. For Men in Tights, Van Patten came back, this time cast as the Abbot, giving the production a quiet thread connecting Brooks's failed 70s TV pitch to its far more successful 90s theatrical version. Brooks had been circling this exact target for almost 20 years before he finally landed the joke that stuck. Every good parody needs an origin story, and this one is a genuinely unusual one. The project reportedly began with Los Angeles dentist Evan Chandler, whose son Jordan had seen Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and thought it took itself far too seriously to be taken seriously. As the story goes, one of Chandler's dental patients happened to be aspiring screenwriter J.D. Shapiro. During an appointment, Chandler pitched Shapiro on the idea that Prince of Thieves was overdue for the full Mel Brooks treatment. Shapiro liked the idea enough to start developing it with Chandler, and the resulting story eventually made its way to Brooks, who bought it and rewrote it substantially into the film we ended up with. Both Chandler and Shapiro received story and writing credit on the finished movie. It's an unlikely chain of events, a kid's offhand movie complaint, relayed through a dental appointment, somehow ending up as a studio comedy starring Patrick Stewart and Dave Chappelle 2 years later. Very early in the film, Robin looks straight at the camera and delivers what's become one of the most quoted lines of the whole movie, pointing out that, unlike some other actors who've played Robin Hood, he can actually pull off an English accent. It's a direct shot at Kevin Costner, whose accent work in Prince of Thieves had famously wandered all over the map and become a bit of a running joke with critics and audiences alike. The problem? That joke depends entirely on the audience already knowing Costner's accent was inconsistent, which meant it didn't automatically translate overseas. So different dub versions rewrote it to hit the same target through different routes. In the German dub, the line was changed to reference how Robin, unlike other Robin Hoods, doesn't cost the producers a fortune, a pun that plays on how kosten, the German word for cost, sounds close to Costner. In the French and Italian dubs, the joke instead became a reference to Costner's other big early 90s hit, pointing out that this Robin Hood doesn't dance with wolves. Same target, 3 completely different punchlines, depending on which country you were watching it in. Long before he had his own sketch show, Dave Chappelle got his first credited film role in Men in Tights, playing Ah Chew, son of Isaac Hayes' character Isnees. It's a small but notable footnote in Chappelle's career. His debut on the big screen came inside a Mel Brooks medieval parody, sharing scenes with a soul music legend playing his father. Hayes, of course, was already a major musical figure by this point, having built his reputation as a composer and performer years before stepping into the role. Having him and Chappelle play father and son in the Merry Men lineup gave the ensemble a genuinely unusual pairing. One performer at the start of a long comedy career, and one who'd already had an entirely separate career in music before ever showing up in Sherwood Forest. The reception at release was rough. The film landed on more than one worst of the year list from critics in 1993, and it was discussed unfavorably by critics of the era, including on television review shows that were influential at the time. Reviews frequently described it as tired or lazy compared to Brooks's earlier work, with several critics wondering aloud how the man behind Young Frankenstein and Blazing Saddles ended up here. And yet, financially, it did just fine. Made on a budget of around $20 million, the film pulled in roughly $72 million worldwide, a solid multiple of its budget even if it wasn't a blockbuster by 1993 standards. More importantly, its reputation kept growing well after its theatrical run ended. Decades on, it's regularly cited by fans and later reviewers as one of the more purely quotable, rewatchable entries in Brooks's filmography. The kind of movie that critics dismissed on arrival and audiences simply decided to love anyway, one home video rental at a time. That gap between the initial reviews and the movie's long-term reputation is worth sitting with for a second. Plenty of comedies from this exact era have simply faded away, remembered by nobody outside of trivia nights. Men in Tights instead settled into a strange middle ground, never quite recognized by contemporary critics as one of Brooks's classics alongside Blazing Saddles or Young Frankenstein, but consistently rediscovered by new audiences who encounter it on cable, streaming, or a friend's insistence that they absolutely have to watch the archery scene. That's arguably the more interesting outcome for a parody film, not universal critical acclaim, but a durability that outlasted the reviews written about it. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth sitting with on its own, because it's such a specific piece of comic craftsmanship. Patrick Stewart's King Richard isn't just a straight-faced authority figure dropped into a silly movie for contrast. He's doing a deliberate impression of Sean Connery's performance as the same character in Prince of Thieves, right down to the accent. It's a joke that works on two levels simultaneously. If you've never seen the original film, Stewart's Richard just plays as a dignified, commanding monarch, a nice tonal anchor amid all the chaos. If you have seen Prince of Thieves, you catch that Stewart is quietly, precisely mocking one specific one specific scene from 2 years earlier. It's a subtler joke than most of what's in the movie, and it's one of the clearest signs of how carefully targeted this parody actually was. Underneath all the slapstick, amid all the Robin Hood-specific parody, the film takes a quick detour into completely unrelated cinematic territory. Dom DeLuise appears in a single scene as Don Giovanni, a mob boss character built entirely as a lampoon of Marlon Brando's performance in The Godfather. It's a strange tonal left turn, a medieval parody pausing briefly to do a 1970s mafia movie impression, but that's very much in keeping with how Brooks structured his comedies generally. Rather than confining the jokes strictly to Robin Hood material, the film treats its parody target as a jumping-off point and freely borrows gags from wherever they'll land, as long as the audience is likely to get the reference. DeLuise's cameo is brief, but it's one of the more memorable detours precisely because it has nothing to do with Sherwood Forest at all. We've already covered the mechanics of the accent joke and how it had to be reworked for other countries. But it's worth ending on just how load-bearing that single line actually is. Coming this early, and this directly at the audience, unlike some other Robin Hoods, I can speak with an English accent. Line does more than land one laugh. It tells you exactly what kind of movie you're about to watch. One that isn't interested in subtlety, that's happy to look directly at the camera and take a specific, pointed